Alas, we finally made it to the thrilling conclusion of my epic favorite album of the year throughout the years I've been alive video series duology that I made to celebrate this channel being a year old. However, after making that first video, I've grown to like this format and may use it again at some point in the future to discuss albums from other decades. Guess it was a good thing I was born in 2001. Shout out to my parents. Anyway, if you've been watching this channel for a while, then you might be thinking,
well, didn't you already make a video about your favorite albums of the decade? What's the point of this video?
And to that I say, I don't know, why does anyone do anything? A lot of my opinions have changed since then anyway, and they'll probably change again, so yeah, live in the moment. Anyway, I don't want to drag out this intro for any longer because you probably know the format by now, unless you didn't watch the first video, in which case, hi. Without further ado, here's the rest of my favorite albums of the year throughout the years I've been alive. There's a good number of contenders for the 2011 spot, like Matana Roberts' extremely powerful Coin Coin Chapter 1, which is a free jazz album about American slavery, the highly influential Blackland Radio 66.6 from Space Ghost Perp, who inspired many of the aesthetic choices in the SoundCloud scene throughout the 2010s, as well as Grouper's AIA Alien Observer, which beautifully incorporates these soft vocal performances into ambient music. The one record from this year that I revisit the most and think has the sharpest track list overall, though, is Right on Time by Secret, an album that was put out on the New Zealand label Crystal Magic Records, which also housed artists like Eyeliner, who's made some notable stuff in the vaporwave scene, as well as Perfect Hair Forever, who I would highly recommend if you like noise rock. It's a shame that this album is so overlooked and nearly impossible to find outside of the two major streaming services, as I feel like it has enough compelling ideas to be mentioned alongside some of the greatest albums of its kind. This is essentially a hypnagogic pop album in the same vein as artists like Ariel Pink and John Mouse, but rather than being an amusing and humorous ode to the old days of lo-fi pop, or something that tries to sound huge and psychedelic while being as minimal as possible, Right on Time excels in creating this alternate universe of pop music by combining these catchy synth-pop grooves with fuzzy production and deadpan vocal delivery. The high-energy rhythms of cuts like Wizard's Chores and Time give the LP somewhat of an 80s throwback vibe as well, yet it maintains this DIY sense of self-awareness to make it fit in more comfortably into the internet age. This becomes even more apparent when you look at what the group's label mates were making around the same time, but there's something special about this album that keeps it from feeling like just another gimmicky nostalgia fest. While most of the songs abide by a similar style as far as synths, percussion, and vocals go, the tracklist manages to stay varied. We get glimpses of neo-psychedelia on cuts like Walking Slow and Yet to Be, and even some minimal synth on Given Up and Remember You. With 12 tracks and a little over half an hour of material, it's a very quick listen full of memorable songs that fulfills this very niche yet inviting lane of pop music. I can only hope that this album gets more attention in the coming years, as it's a perfect summation of the aesthetic choices from the early 2010s underground, exemplified in its own distinct way. James Ferraro was an artist who I've been meaning to make a video on for quite some time now. Starting in the early to mid 2000s, releasing drone and noise music under a slew of various monikers and in different groups, Ferraro proved himself as a talented force to be reckoned with in the experimental music scene. When he started putting out work under his own name in the late 2000s and early 2010s though, that's when he became a generation-defining artist for the internet age. His catalog is vast, eclectic, and somewhat hard to navigate, almost in a way that embodies the internet itself. Whether you're into the hypnagogic ambience of projects like Multitopia, the tongue-in-cheek underwater pop music of Night Dolls with Hairspray, or even the recontextualization of 90s computer music that got him popular with the vaporwave crowd, there's something in his catalog for everyone. Perhaps my favorite project of his is this elusive compilation of singles and EPs from 2012 called Prince of Rain, Bad Boy Flame. I say elusive because it wasn't put out by any label that he was on, nor can you find the entire project anywhere online aside from this YouTube re-upload and this VK archive account. The closest I could find to an official mention of it was on the Hippos and Tanks Facebook page, where they uploaded this now deleted video of the title track on April 20th, 2012. And I know it was just the title track because I reached out to the one commenter to see if he could remember, and he could, so shout out to him. I'm pretty sure this is an unofficial compilation of spare tracks that were on his VK page that have since been taken down, but I find this album's esoteric origin to add to its charm, on top of giving more context to the obscene cover art. That is until somebody ruins the mystery free by commenting exactly where it came from and then telling me how stupid I am for not knowing, although that would be useful information to have for when I do decide to make a video on him. Context aside, Prince of Rain Bad Boy Flame is a phenomenal culmination of numerous styles in electronic music and is in my opinion the strongest record in the James Ferraro canon. The first half of this album is full of shorter songs that are more immediate and catchy, but still approach their genres from a unique perspective. The song Rainstick Fizz Plus, for example, is a funky instrumental hip-hop joint that finds a way to combine glitch hop with a more old-school style of sampling. There's also the song Save the Planet, which puts this wonky groove in a more ambient context. The real meat of this project, though, are the longer tracks, like Earth Jump, which is a beautiful progressive trance song that he actually performed an extended version of at Primavera Sound that became a little more viral, and the strange ambient piece that is Rain 1 and 2, which was released as an EP under the name Bodyguard. While it was difficult not to put Lil B's Godfather mixtape in this spot, Prince of Rain Bad Boy Flame is one of those albums where I could speak at length about what makes every single song so amazing, but I'll save that for another time. With the legendary internet rap label Goth Money Records being founded around this time, I knew I wanted to put a Black Kray project in this spot. The problem was though, do I go with the darker Witch House inspired epic that is Crack Clouds Over Art's Kitchen, or the more ethereal and abstract goodness of Ice Cream and Mac 10s? I decided to go with the latter because 1, Crack Clouds technically came out in 2012 as an even longer project, with most of the material on this version being ripped straight from that one, and 2, I think this project is where Kray really came into his own and approached cloud rap from an even more outside the box angle. While the beats on this record are a little strange, as they're able to carry this psychedelic sound while usually putting more emphasis on the rhythm section than anything else in the mix, the real thing that makes this tape stand out to me is the way he incorporates vocals. The rapping on here doesn't really flow in the same way you'd expect it to on any other hip-hop or even cloud rap album, as Kray intoxicatingly chants his way through most of these songs at a very slow pace. There's definitely some Space Ghost Purpisms at play here and a bit of a Memphis influence as well, but I think the way he decides to layer all of these different vocal refrains on top of each other is a big part of what makes it such a unique sounding album. Especially for 2005, I mean, he was only 7 years old when he recorded this thing.
My name Money Man, just like beans, everybody feel 'em in the air, yeah!
Okay, memes aside, this was a pretty definitive record for the underground at the time of its release, and a sign of what was to come in the SoundCloud scene. That being said though, it's way too distinct and avant-garde, even when compared to other albums in the Goth Money catalog, to really feel dated in any way, even with the obvious tongue-in-cheek attitude that the project carries. If you're a fan of experimental hip-hop and haven't heard this thing, or anything else in the Goth Money canon for that matter, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So I know I ranked Benji pretty high on my 2010s list from a few months ago, and even though I still think it's a beautiful record that uses its meandering approach to songwriting to capture this feeling of warmth and nostalgia that few other albums have been able to with little more than an acoustic guitar and vocals, it has grown off me a little bit in recent times. Not necessarily because I think it has any gaping flaws, but with pretty much every song sticking to the same rambly formula, it can become a little monotonous when taken in as a whole. There is another album from 2014 though that I've talked about before, and it's grown on me even more since then. It's the debut project from one of my favorite artists of the decade, and while it's not my favorite of his, it is probably the album that I come back to the most from 2014. If you couldn't guess already, I'm talking about Gluee, baby! A lot of people have been asking me to make another video about Drain Gang covering their more recent albums, and while I would like to revisit them at some point, I'm gonna wait until they have more under their belts that falls in line with this ambient pop inspired sound that they've been working with recently. In the meantime though, Gluee is a tape that I find myself loving more and more with each listen. The compressed and unpolished sound that this album carries, especially when compared to later Blade records, makes it feel more stripped down to the bare essentials of what makes his style so captivating. The synth leads are glitchy yet melodic, the beats are spastic but catchy, and the slightly more homogenized mixing works surprisingly to its benefit. Every layer of instrumentation hits extremely hard on nearly every song, to the point where I could see some people finding it a little overwhelming. Even with cuts like Shadowface and Upgrade Enabled, which act as a nice chaser to everything else going on, the record feels purposefully more abrasive than most other cloud rap from this time. The real thing that I think makes or breaks Blade's music for a lot of people though, is his very prominent and liberal use of autotune, and this album is no exception to that. That being said though, I think that Blade's delivery here is more emotional than maybe anywhere else in his discography, as the vocals sound more like an impassioned cry for help than a drained out monotoned one. even if you're not a fan of some of Blade's later records, I'd still say this is worth a shot, as it seems to be one of his most widely appealing albums. Not to mention all the brilliant songs on here, like the unforgettable posse cut eBay, where each Drain member shows off their unique styles from one another over one of the most futuristic beats to come out of its time, or the closing track Unreal, which juxtaposes this cute and simple synth melody with a crooning and hard to pin down vocal lead. My favorite on the album though has to be the intro track Delete, as it may as well act as an overture for not only this album, but really the entire weirder side of the emo rap wave. It goes through numerous instrumental changes, starting off as a slower paced alternative R&B joint, before exploding into one of the most attention-grabbing vocal performances that Blade has ever given. Tyboy Digital closes out the song by sounding more relaxed as he usually does, effectively allowing the track to encompass multiple moods and musical styles while sounding totally seamless. It's easily one of the sharpest cloud rap tapes to come out of the 2010s, and I think it holds more impact than a lot of people are willing to give it credit for. Yep, that's right, you guessed it, it's To Pimp a Butterfly. Not only did I already talk about this album in my 2010s video, but so did everyone else, so yep, that's pretty much it, moving on. Okay, I'm just kidding, but I am going to use this time to talk about another album that I think is a little more underrated, even if it isn't on the list. In 2007, a group of Canadian guys decided to form an experimental rock band and name themselves after the one thing that they all have in common. The following year, they would put out their self-titled debut, and while it wouldn't sell quite as well as Crazy Frog's Crazy Hits, it got pretty good critical reception for how it managed to meld these entrancing rhythms into distorted soundscapes. They would put out another album a couple of years later called Public Strain that refined their sound even further and managed to chart higher on the Pitchfork year-end list. Unfortunately, the group would disband in 2012 because the title of their album became a little too real, and it was also around this time that one of their guitar players, Chris Raymer, sadly passed away. The remaining three members would go on to do their own side projects, including bassist Matthew Flegel and drummer Michael Wallace, forming a band with a couple of other guys called Viet Cong, later renamed to Preoccupations. The group's full-length debut from 2015 is a pretty awesome post-punk record with a lot of groovy bass lines and murky guitars that are worked into these longer and more progressive songs than you typically expect from an album in its genre. It's so great, in fact, that I'm done talking about it. Patrick Flegel, the other Flegel from Women, began a project under the name Cindy Lee all the way back in 2012 and put out 2 albums in 2015, the second of which is called Act of Tenderness, and it's my personal favorite album to come from Women. It takes some of the preconceived ideas that were on records like Public Strain and puts them through a poppier, yet even more obtuse lens. This album is essentially half ambient music that borders on ambient pop due to the melodic vocal performances, and half noise pop that borders on noise music. It's an absolutely fascinating combination of sounds that are brought together by the eerie feminine vocals. Cuts like Wandering in Solitude and my favorite on the album, The Last Train's Come and Gone, are great examples of tracks that have a minimal composition to enhance the echoey and faraway vocals. It's like I'm lost outside somewhere late at night and happen to be 2 blocks away from the local cult. Someone on Rate Your Music described this album as Lady in the Radiator sings the hits, and that is probably the best possible summation of this album. If you want to hear something creepy and minimal that'll get stuck in your head and haunt you for the rest of your days, then Act of Tenderness by Cindy Lee will certainly not disappoint. So similarly to the 2015 spot, my favorite album of the year is Danny Brown's Atrocity Exhibition, which has also been talked about to death by everyone, so I'm just going to place this on the list really quick and then talk about another underrated album. Flood Network is the second full-length LP from Australian psych pop artist Katie Day, and quite a brilliant one at that. Despite only being a little over 30 minutes, it feels more diverse and bigger in scope than nearly any other psych project to come out of the past several years. This is partially due to how the album is structured, as every other track is a short instrumental interlude, and while this might sound like it'd get really annoying after track 4, it's actually hardly noticeable. Every song bleeds into one another, with the interludes typically building off of the melody that ended the previous song and morphing it into something completely different to kick off the next track. It uses this to explore a wide variety of sounds while still being a cohesive experience. Pretty much every core song on here is a highlight for me, like the hard acoustic strumming on the opening that, when combined with the weird synths and vocal manipulation, feels like a freak folktronica song. I also look forward to hearing the fractured and repetitive groove on the track Frailty, as it reminds me of something that David Byrne and Brian Eno would have created in the 80s, and Fear of the Light might seriously be one of the best experimental pop songs ever made. While it doesn't have a chorus in the conventional sense, it pretty much feels like one giant hook after another, with a colorful palette of instrumental layers all building up and playing off of each other before crescendoing and continuing onward. That's also not to say that the instrumental interludes aren't enjoyable as well, but they usually feel more like a connected part of the previous song than they do a standalone cut. That is maybe with the exception of the final one, F8, which continues to drone out the simple guitar riff on the previous song and essentially morphs it into a miniature post-rock joint. There's not really much about this record that I don't love, and if you're a fan of artists like Björk or Animal Collective, then this is easily a must listen. There's a really cool colored vinyl of it as well that you can buy on her Bandcamp, and I'd love to show off my copy, but I'm away from home and I didn't bring it. A genre that I've been seeing a lot more people talk about in the past few years is this uniquely amateurish and cozy approach to dance music called Outsider House. While the genre has existed for a while, it had a pretty big year in 2017 with the rise of artists like Kater Liviansky and arguably the most popular act in this style, DJ Seinfeld. Both of these artists took the core rhythms of house music and converted them into these warm and low-key bangers that are perfect for when you want to have a dance party at 4 in the morning and your mom is asleep across the hall. An artist who's garnered a devoted cult following over the past few years, though, is DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ. This artist has such a vibrant and one-of-a-kind approach to house music that becomes immediately recognizable after hearing only a couple of songs. The irresistibly funky grooves, wide abundance of samples, and production choices that remind me of an old-school Sonic the Hedgehog game make her one of the most interesting artists in the field of electronic music working today. She's released 4 albums in total, and while they're all pretty fantastic, her debut, Making Magic, from 2017, is easily her most popular and ambitious project so far. There are over 2 hours of material on this thing, and though it's not the most unpredictable album in the world after you've heard the first handful of songs, it does manage to pack in just as much emotion, nuance, and attention to detail into every single track. The sheer amount of moods that this record is able to capture while sticking to the sample-heavy deep house formula helps to give each song an identity of its own. I love the bittersweet vocals and synth hits on the song Life Can Be, the wonderfully romantic and melodically engaging Love You Forever, and I can confidently say that It's Just a Natural Thing is the most beautiful song to have ever sampled Rick Astley's voice. Speaking of vocal samples, they appear all over this thing and greatly contribute to the theme of every song. The uncertainty in the spoken clip that appears on DJ Baywatch gives an even greater context to the faded pianos and bass-heavy drums. I also have to mention the track All the Beautiful Things You Do, because it samples Natalie Portman giving a commencement speech at Harvard.
Thank you. I can't wait to see how you do all the beautiful things you will do. How you do all the beautiful things you will do.
I know the length may look a little bit intimidating for some people, especially considering that house is historically not a very album-centric genre, but the way all of these different sounding dance tunes flow together as one emotionally potent experience almost makes this record feel comparable to Since I Left You, as cliche as that may sound. If you check out nothing else from this album, I'd at the very least recommend the song Starting Over, as it's one of the most detailed and memorable house songs you're ever likely to come across. If you like house music and haven't delved into this artist yet, then I hope I've helped you set your plans for the evening. Earl Sweatshirt's Some Rap Songs is an absolute masterpiece. Playing off of the modern abstract production style that the Slums Collective helped to put on the map, Earl creates this dense and trippy dive into the darkest depths of his mind that's executed perfectly without wasting a second. It might only be 25 minutes in length, but with the amount of time that you'll likely spend trying to decipher the lyrics and make sense of the instrumentals, it may as well be twice as long. It's a record that I'm confident will be remembered for generations to come, and stands as one of the highest points for music in the 2010s in my opinion. It's for this reason that my favorite album of 2018 is Red Light, baby! Okay, for real though, Red Light probably would be my favorite album of 2018 because it's by far my most listened to, but I already put a Bladee album on here and I don't want to put the same artist twice, so we'll do the next best thing and put Echo 2K. Yeah, this Beauty Sleep bootleg, pretty amazing. It might be cheating to give a spot to an unofficial compilation of songs, especially when most of them didn't even come out in the respective year, but it's my list and I don't care. When I first heard this thing, I thought it was a pretty cool sign of things to come from Echo, compiling some of his singles, tracks from collaborative albums, and unfinished snippets into a demo demo-like experience that pretty much showcased everything he had to offer at the time. Even though he's now finally released his official debut album E, which is absolutely excellent, I've grown to appreciate Beauty Sleep even more. While there are numerous cuts on here that are clearly unfinished fragments of songs that never came to be, the way that they've all been curated together is surprisingly cohesive. There are some abrupt track endings and awkward transitions, but I feel the imperfect nature of this record only adds to the vivid emotional display that it conveys. What makes it so different from anything else in the GTB-SG canon is that rather than being a collection of experimental cloud rap songs that pull heavily from alternative R&B and have an outsider slant to them, Beauty Sleep is closer to an ambient record with a fair amount of instrumental tracks and more low-key vocal performances. In fact, most of, if not all of the cloud rap that appears on this bootleg are songs that were already finished and officially released. This makes Beauty Sleep fall in line with the postmodern aesthetic of Drain Gang, but viewed through a completely different lens. Even putting aside all of the demo-ish qualities that this project carries, Echo has always had a more unique shtick than the other MCs in his crew. While he's no stranger to using autotune, he's able to do so sparingly, as his voice is smoother and more dynamic than Bladee or Tyboy. He's also a little more adventurous with what genres he likes to tackle. In contrast to the gorgeously produced, artful pop bliss of E, Beauty Sleep is oftentimes a very jagged and harsh record, with tracks like Shout Out to My Stalkers and Crush Resist pulling heavily from noise music. It actually makes sense that he would take a shot at making tracks like this, as it's a little known fact that Echo and Bladee actually started making music when they were only 12 and 13 years old in a noisecore band called Crosshead. And yes, I'm not making this up. Yeah, it's not the best noisecore ever made, but it's an interesting piece of history for all the drainers in my audience, and there's probably a few of you. I've grown to love pretty much every song on Beauty Sleep, from the vocoder breakdowns of Forever United and X Exposed, to the calm and inviting ambient pieces like Perfectly Still and the title track. Even cuts like I'm Alright and I'm Gone, which would probably feel like throwaways in any other context, feel like companion pieces that hold thematic weight when placed where they are in the track list. This is especially true for the intro, Play On Like Atari, as it's a pretty infamous track in the Drainer community because a snippet of it was released all the way back in 2013, and since then the Cups have won the World Series and Half-Life 3 came out, but we still haven't gotten Play 'Em Like Atari. There does exist a live version of the song that Echo performed at a photo shoot, as well as an official instrumental, and people have even edited all of the assets together to create the closest thing to the full official song that we're likely ever gonna get. The point is that this 56-second snippet feels like a full complete track when framed as a short intro to the album, and it's quite a catchy one at that. The biggest high points of this record, though, are still probably the tracks that are actually complete, like Guardian Angels and Hold Me Down Like Gravity, which is one of my favorite songs of all time. The overwhelmingly washed out layers of instrumentation that meld into one another are perfectly complemented by Echo's hopeless yet optimistic delivery. The lyrics may seem a little cheesy on the surface, with the constant references to video games and just the internet in general, but I think it paints a pretty vivid picture of someone who's depressed and uses these things as a coping mechanism, almost like a song about drug addiction where the drug is art. I also think that the nods to Pokemon, Xbox controllers, and video quality are fitting to the instrumental that sounds like a culmination of all the world's technology coming together with a trap beat behind it. The song that was released in 2013 happens to be my favorite track on my favorite album of 2018. It's kind of funny how that happened, huh? I mean, AAA Powerline came out in 2018 and that's on here too, so I'm just gonna place this right here real quick and then move on. E. No, I'm just kidding. Speaking of albums where most of the music from the year I'm placing it didn't come out that year, my 2019 spot is another compilation. However, given the context of what the record is, I think more people would understand its classification as a 2019 album, even if only a fraction of it came out that year. I've talked about The Caretaker a little bit before, but since then I fully delved into his 6.5-hour monolith that is his magnum opus Everywhere at the End of Time, and now my life is worse. In case any of you aren't aware, The Caretaker is one of several monikers of English electronic artist James Leland Kirby, and it's the one he's found the most success with in his over 2-decade-long career. He's been putting out music under this pseudonym since 1999, but really started to explore the themes of memory loss in 2006 with his album Theoretically Pure and Terrorgrade Amnesia. This record contains nearly 4 hours of dark ambient compositions, with track titles such as Memory 1, Memory 2, Memory 11, Memory 26, and everyone's favorite, Memory 69, his 2011 album, An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, was specifically made to reflect the ability of Alzheimer's patients to recall the songs from their past, and with them, recollections of places, people, moods, and sensations. That's a direct quote from his Bandcamp page. All of the music on here was made from sampling jazz recordings from the late 20s and 30s and manipulating them in a way that sounds like a fading distant memory. As amazing as that record was, he would start another project 5 years later called Everywhere at the End of Time that explored a similar concept much more thoroughly. It's to the point where now Empty Bliss feels more like a testing of the waters of what could be accomplished with this idea, but I still wouldn't consider that record to be obsolete, as it focuses more on the idea of remembering music than it does a full embodiment of the disease. Everywhere at the End of Time, on the other hand, consists of 6 different albums that were released over the span of 4 years, and are each based on a different stage of dementia. The music starts off pretty well composed and hummable, albeit a little unsettling, but gradually becomes a lot more disturbing. You'll start to notice some of the same melodies that you've heard earlier on the record played again in a way that's much more fragmented and eventually hardly recognizable. The project is at its most gut-wrenching for me during stage 4, as this is where we go from the shorter and more digestible tracks to 20+ minute compositions that feel hopeless and inescapable, as if all of these memories that these tracks may have helped you recall are fading away and holding on for dear life. By the end of stage 5, the sounds have boiled down to staticky silence that buries mere notes of melodies that you'll do your best to cling onto for as long as possible. The haunting drones and bits of noise that fuel stage 6 are now a completely different entity from how the album started, with virtually nothing in the way of melody or rhythm to even try and make sense of. The final track on the record becomes a transcendental experience that is maybe the closest music has come to sounding like how it feels to die. I mean, there's no way to know for certain, but if you listen to the entire 6.5-hour record up until this point and didn't cry during the last 5 minutes, then you're probably already dead. This definitely isn't a record that I can recommend to everyone, especially if the subject matter is particularly triggering for you, but it's an incredible work of art that is undeniably poignant. Speaking of art, I have to compliment Ivan Seal for creating these beautiful pieces of visual art to go along with the music, as they fantastically display the effects of each stage with visuals that become harder and harder to make sense of before turning into an entirely blank canvas. I'd recommend checking out these videos if you want a more in-depth look at this project, as I think it's a more fun record to discuss and try and make sense of than it is to actually listen to, but it's still something that I think should be in everyone's life to some capacity. I don't freaking know, we still got 3 months left. Most of the releases that I've loved so far this year have come from the Surge and Hexed scene that I just recently made an entire video about, but as far as my favorite album so far this year goes, I'd probably have to give it to the newest record from Japanese math rock band Tricot. That is assuming Panchiko's death metal doesn't count because it technically came out 20 years ago. I'm a sucker for math rock, especially when it's put into songs that are more vocal driven. I appreciate Hella and Dawn Cab as much as the next guy, but I tend to return to acts like Ferraro, Falusu, and even TTNG a hell of a lot more often. I also find it impressive when a math rock record is able to be hook-based and work its angular rhythms into conventional song structures without being too flashy or distracting from the core songwriting. Black by Tricot does this exceptionally well, as pretty much every song becomes a memorable spot in the tracklist after only a couple of listens. While the songs on here mostly excel in how well the hooks, bass lines, guitar melodies, drums, and vocals come together into compelling songs, the group is still able to shake up their formula with cuts like One Season that are quieter and emphasize the vocal harmonies more so than the rhythms, and maybe the most linear song here, Himitsu, that sees the usual math rock shtick eventually become much noisier and more distorted. It's a very fun and replayable record that I found myself coming back to a lot this year, and while I still don't know if it'll remain in this spot by the end of the year, I'll go with it for now. Alas, we finally reached the end of my epic video duology that took way too long to finish. Again, I might reuse this format to talk about albums from other decades if I'm feeling particularly lazy and want to give myself a break from talking super in depth about one particular artist or genre for 20 minutes, but for now I'll get back to doing that. I'll leave a link to the album Topster chart in the description so you can refer back to it if you so desire, and as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, you know the drill.